The greatest healer on the entire continent, that was Will. In the decisive battle against the Calamity, none of the hunters had enough power to slay the dragons, but as long as Will was present, no one fell on the field. It didn't matter how devastating the wounds were. He patched everything up, pulled his allies from the jaws of death, and sent them back to war, over and over again, without pause, without end. What should have been a blessing became the worst of nightmares. His fellow warriors grew weary, being resurrected against their own will, rebuilt from scratch and thrown back into the chaos of war, time and time again, was a torture that no glorious death could match. And so, instead of turning their rage against the enemy, they turned it against the only one responsible for keeping them alive. The general himself drove a sword into Will's shoulder and declared that finally he would know what it meant to suffer. And that was the end of everything. With no will to carry on, the army fell apart. The dragons gave no chance of escape. Will discovered that not even the most powerful healer in the world survives inside the stomach of one of those creatures. But the story didn't end there. Will woke up 5 years in the past with every memory of the apocalypse carved into his mind. He knew what was coming. He knew every mistake that had been made. And this time, he had made a decision. He would no longer stay in the rear, stitching wounds while the world crumbled around him. He was going to learn how to fight. He was going to enter the Schwartz Academy, the greatest school of offensive magic in the world, and stop depending on others to protect what he loved. Then his eyes landed on the table. There was the enrollment form. If that was in front of him, then it was real. He had truly traveled back in time. Will opened the door and faced the world outside. Year 416 of the Salsarian calendar, 1 week before the enrollment deadline for the HEALER Academy. 5 years ago, he had believed the dragon had ended his existence, but if his last wish had been granted, then he knew exactly what he needed to do. He was going to enroll in Schwartz. It was common knowledge that healers were incapable of using offensive magic. Will intended to destroy that belief once and for all. There would be obstacles, many of them, but he carried the memories of an entire lifetime and all the mastery of healing magic he had earned in it. Using everything he knew, he could change the future. Schwartz was recognized as the best school on the continent for battle magic, capable of turning any mage into an elite combatant. Someone he had known in his previous life had also graduated from there, but the academy's theories were kept in absolute secrecy, accessible only to its own students. There was probably no precedent for a healer being accepted in Schwartz. The question was how to get around that. In the end, it might all come down to money. The school attracted heavy investment from nobles because of its reputation, but Will had not managed to bring his fortune from his previous life. Even if he started working immediately, there wouldn't be enough time before the enrollment date. It was then that a familiar voice called his name. Will recognized it immediately. It was his sister. She was still alive. She asked, with a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, whether he had a stomach ache. Will shook his head and murmured that some dust had gotten in his eye. She laughed, wished them a good day, and moved on. Will stood still, watching her walk away. In this life, he could prevent the tragedy that awaited her further ahead. His magic would be enough. He could save those he had not been able to save before. After gathering his thoughts, Will mentioned that he had figured out something important and quickly explained the plan to his sister before leaving. The Alliance of Magical Academies was the organization responsible for unifying all the schools in the kingdom and deliberating on magical education. At that time, the president of the Alliance also held the position of director of the Schwartz Academy, but there was a period when he virtually vanished from the meetings. The reason became clear when the scene shifted to his mansion. The director was standing beside a bed, his hand resting gently on the face of a young woman lying unconscious, covered in cold sweat. He called out to her in a heavy voice, "Marie." He said that the healer from that day had also been unable to help, but he promised he would find someone. He asked her to hold on a little longer. That was why he disappeared. He was completely consumed by the care of his ailing granddaughter. In the previous timeline, the magical medicine of the era had not been able to save her, and Marie had died. Then, someone came in through the window. The newcomer asked with surprising calm whether the director would allow him to take care of that case. The director recognized him immediately. It was Will, the scholarship student from HEALER Academy, whose talent in healing magic was widely known within the Alliance, though he wasn't the type who usually came in through windows. Will scratched his head and laughed. He acknowledged to himself that his past self would never have done something like this, but losing a life seemed to have made him bolder. Either way, there was no time to waste, not for him and not for the girl, and he could heal her. The director questioned what his true intentions were. Will replied that they could talk about that afterward, but that first he needed permission to treat Marie. The illness had advanced faster than he had expected. The two stared at each other for a tense seconds. Then the director relented. He ordered Will to show what he could do. Will sat down beside the girl and took a deep breath, aware of the weight of the gaze bearing down on him. The director of an offensive magic academy had exactly the kind of bearing one would expect, the kind that ends a life the moment someone takes a wrong step. Even so, Will extended his hand, took Marie's in, and began the healing process. His mana reserve had diminished upon traveling back in time, but the formulas remained intact in his memory. The formula for treating Zor's disease wasn't supposed to be discovered for another 2 years, but his current self had already mastered it. Marie opened her eyes. Will let out a long sigh of relief. With a tired smile, he explained that her resistance was completely depleted and asked her to rest. She turned her face away, a little embarrassed, and agreed in silence. The director stepped closer and asked in a softer voice than before whether Marie was truly all right. Marie confirmed that she was fine and said she couldn't remember the last time she had felt so light. The old man could barely hold back his tears. He murmured that he understood completely, and that it was an immense relief. In another room, away from his granddaughter, the director turned his attention to Will and thanked him sincerely. He said that if there was anything he could do for him, all he had to do was ask. Will thanked him and mentioned that the request was not among the most complicated. As the director had just witnessed, his command of healing magic was at an extraordinary level. There was nothing left to learn in that area. For that reason, he wanted to enroll in the Schwartz Academy. The director was surprised. He questioned whether Will truly intended to place a talent of that caliber in an offensive magic academy rather than continuing in healing, and whether he understood the weight of that choice. Will confirmed without hesitation. The director studied the young man's eyes for a few moments. Then he said that his authority existed precisely for moments like this, and that he would take care of everything. He extended his hand, and the two sealed the agreement with a firm handshake. Far from there, another man remarked, half in disbelief, that the old fox had done something impulsive when it was least expected. He found himself wondering whether Will would be able to keep up with Schwartz's curriculum. After all, healers were considered far too physically frail for that. On the day of the entrance ceremony, the director spoke before all those present. The Schwartz Academy was a boarding school specializing in offensive magic, with an exclusive curriculum, vast grounds, numerous training fields, cutting-edge research facilities, and one of the largest libraries in the kingdom. It counted influential alumni among its ranks and received direct support from the crown. There was no better place to learn offensive magic. No healer had ever crossed those doors before. The director made it clear that many difficulties awaited Will, but that if he studied at that academy, he would have a real chance of becoming a true mage. Will thought of everything he had lived through. There, in that place, his destiny would be rewritten. But reality arrived early, and it arrived hard. In the very first classes, Will ran into the first obstacle. A professor ordered him to demonstrate some technique. Will obeyed, concentrated energy in the palms of his hands, and attempted to conjure a fire spell, but only smoke came out. The professor declared it another failure, and warned that he would not allow Will in his classes for as long as he was incapable of hitting a target with basic offensive magic. He sent him to practice on the training fields behind the school. Will apologized and asked whether he could at least receive some instruction on how to execute it. There was no way to practice something one didn't know how to do. The professor replied curtly, teaching a healer was simply a waste of time. Will tried another approach and asked whether he could at least study theory in the library. The answer was equally direct. There were no books aimed at healers in that collection. It was then that a blonde-haired student fired a spell without warning, hitting Will square on and knocking him to the ground. The blonde laughed and asked whether he couldn't even dodge a basic attack. After all, this was an offensive magic academy. There was no room for someone who didn't even know how to defend himself. If he took the hit, that was his problem. The director agreed with the student and suggested that Will ask to be readmitted to a healing academy. The blonde finished with a smile, saying that at least there he would find people kind enough to console him. Will got up, shot a glare full of anger behind him, and walked out. Later, sitting on a bench outside, he faced reality head-on. There was no sign of progress in offensive magic whatsoever, but he had known from the start that it would be difficult. Healing magic and offensive magic stem from completely distinct sources. Mages convert mana through spell formulas, and the type of mana defines what each one is capable of doing. Dynamic mana generates fire, explosions, destruction, while healers possess only static mana. Even so, Schwartz had a reputation for forging elite combatants practically from scratch. There had to be some method. If he could convert static mana into dynamic mana, mana, he was certain he could master the rest. The problem was that getting anywhere near the classes wasn't even possible. Professors and students despised healers in equal measure. Even so, giving up was not an option. The person he admired most had started with little mana and perfected everything right there, inside Schwartz. Coming here had not been a mistake, but fumbling around blindly wasn't going to get him anywhere either. He wasn't allowed inside the library, but maybe it was worth trying to sneak in. A voice cut through the silence of the night, asking what he was doing there at that hour. Will apologized automatically, and then recognized the person standing before him. She stepped closer, looked down, and then raised her eyes until they met Will's directly. It was Professor Veronica. The weight of that encounter hit him deep. In his previous life, the two of them had fought side by side. She was a first-class battle mage, and in the final moments, they had been together. Her magical sword was capable of cutting through anything in a fraction of a second, and now, in this new life, he had the chance to meet her again. It was only then that he noticed she had her sword in hand. Veronica explained that she had spotted a suspicious student, and that it was only natural to be on guard. She wanted to know what he was scheming, whether he was planning something or simply burning with eagerness to learn. Will assessed the situation in an instant. Veronica was at a completely different level from anything he had faced before. If she attacked, he was finished. He replied that it was just eagerness. She sheathed her sword. Will confirmed her name, and Veronica agreed, but wanted to know if that was how he addressed a professor. Will was surprised. In his previous life, the age gap between them wasn't that large. Veronica explained that she had skipped years and become a professor right at the start, that very same year. Given her talent, it made perfect sense, and that was when Will spotted the opening. He asked whether he could attend her classes and how he should go about enrolling. Veronica replied that she didn't have her own class. Because she had skipped years, she barely attended the regular classes. During that period, she was acting only as a designated teaching assistant to answer students' questions. The idea being that since she was closer to their age, the students would feel at ease. For some reason though, no one ever asked her anything. Perfect. Will got straight to the point. If a healer wanted to learn offensive magic, what does she think he should do? Veronica replied that she had noticed something unusual in his mana flow, so it was him, the newcomer everyone was talking about. A healer seeking offensive magic is something rare, but if any method exists for dealing with dynamic mana, she could certainly teach it to him. Will was surprised, but Veronica continued without hesitation. Even so, it would be impossible for him to use offensive magic in the conventional way. He possessed static mana in excess. Even if he managed to forge dynamic mana, it would simply dissolve within the static. Any alternative formula would also fail. Will asked directly whether there was absolutely no path for a healer to use offensive magic. Veronica confirmed there wasn't. He absorbed the answer. The plan had fallen apart. But leaving there without a way forward wasn't an option either. If no method existed, he would have to create it on his own. He thanked Veronica and said he would think it over by himself. Veronica said she wasn't finished yet. It was true that healers couldn't use offensive magic, but there was a way for a healer to become a battle mate. Will didn't understand right away. Veronica pointed to the sword at her own belt. With it, any strike could bring down an enemy. Then she pointed to the chair beside her, made of wood, built for sitting. But if someone picked it up and threw it at another person, it would easily knock them down. Nobody thinks of using a chair as a weapon because it was made for another purpose. How any object is used depends on who is holding it. The same applied to her own hand. It could deliver a gentle touch. Will was caught off guard when Veronica flicked him on the forehead and stated that in the same way, she could also hurt him like that. In short, it all came down to application. Anything could become a weapon depending on how it was used. Will understood instantly. She was talking about using healing magic to attack. Veronica confirmed it with a nod. He couldn't understand how he had never considered that before. It had never even crossed his mind. Veronica explained that was precisely what defined the nature of each person, which is why battle mages aren't interested in healing and healers aren't interested in combat. But he was different. The simple fact of having enrolled in an offensive magic academy already made him an anomaly, and then reality, his mana wasn't that of a pure healer. Will considered that perhaps he hadn't noticed that because of the regression. Veronica told him to become aware of it, to embrace the aggressive fury within himself. If he did that, his healing magic would be perfectly capable of crushing enemies. The next day, on the training field, Will was still processing everything Veronica had said. Her analogy had been strange, but it had been a genuine revelation. He kept wondering why she had shown no resistance to the idea of a healer using offensive magic, and the fact that she already had a theory ready was at the very least intriguing. The instructor interrupted his thoughts. Since the class had an odd number of students, Will would also be participating in that day's training bouts. The fact that he couldn't use offensive magic was entirely his own problem. Even if he took a beating without being able to fight back, he would reap what he sowed. The pairs were already set. Will looked at his assigned opponent and immediately realized it was a setup. Apolpus came from a renowned noble family and was constantly surrounded by flatterers, but from what Will had observed in class, that name wasn't merely imposing. He was a genuinely skilled battlemate. Apolpus shouted that healing magic is useless against humiliation and that Will would go running home in tears after getting beaten. Will found his personality irritating in a way he hadn't expected. In the past, he would have ignored it. This time, the guy genuinely got under his skin, and he wanted to test Veronica's theory anyway, on top of getting a little payback. He addressed Apolpus in a formal tone and declared that he would not accept a forfeit. Will stated that he had absolutely no intention of backing down, but that he had a proposal. If he lost the bout, he would publicly acknowledge that he had no talent for offensive magic and would leave shorts. The instructor said it was a sensible decision. Will continued, but if he won, he wanted permission to attend regular classes. The instructor questioned what kind of nonsense that was. Apolpus shouted that a weakling was clinging to an impossible delusion just to face his own fear, and that without anything to break, there would be no fun in it at all. The instructor put an end to the discussion. Impossible hypotheticals were a waste of time. The two should take their positions. He raised his hand and announced the start of the bout. Apolpus concentrated and summoned countless daggers around himself, announcing his blade creation magic. Swords conjured from nothing, all pointed at an opponent who couldn't even use basic offensive magic. Will concentrated right after. He channeled his healing magic, opened his eyes with total focus, and began to dodge the blades, weaving from side to side with precision. Apolpus was visibly surprised. As he moved, he reflected. The true essence of his healing magic was the manipulation of life, controlling vital activity and maximizing the body's natural regenerative capacity to its fullest. But healing wasn't the only thing he could control. Will had converted his magic into something offensive, and Apolpus wasn't enjoying it one bit. He yelled that his opponent shouldn't think himself special just for getting lucky. In response, Will activated physical reinforcement, seized one of the blades mid-hair, and with a single precise motion, swept all the others away. They hung suspended for a moment before dropping to the ground with a muffled sound. It was exactly what he needed. He positioned the dagger in front of him and announced that he was borrowing the weapon and that he was ready to fight. The crowd around him had absolutely no idea what had just happened. Someone in the audience asked aloud whether that was offensive magic. Will concluded internally that it wasn't. It was healing magic being used offensively. Apparently, no one else could tell the difference. Apolpus didn't accept the situation. He shouted that Will couldn't be serious, that he was capable of summoning far more blades than those few. A battle magician couldn't be defeated by a healer. Will advanced, dodging every blade thrown his way. With each deflection, Apolpus's frustration grew. He declared that it wasn't a matter of quantity and that he would increase the size of the swords to see what Will thought of that. Will blocked with the dagger. Apolpus shouted in disbelief and pressed with even more force, adding rotation to the blades and pouring everything he had into it. Will calculated internally that he would need to intensify physical reinforcement a little more. He blocked the blow. Apolpus screamed that it was impossible. Will thought to himself that he would have to heal up properly afterward and murmured an apology before moving the dagger. A wall of sand erupted between the two combatants. Both fell back, caught completely off guard. The professor had intervened. The sand was his. He announced that there were still other bouts to be held and ordered them to stop immediately. Will looked coldly at Apolpus on the ground and asked in an almost casual tone whether he could attend regular classes from that point on. Apolpus clenched his teeth and told him to do as he pleased. Will thanked him and walked away. As he walked, he reflected on what he had just felt. That was his form of offensive magic, and it had worked far better than he expected, to the point of defeating a talented battle mage his own age, all thanks to Professor Veronica. There was a path for a healer to become a battle mage. He could get there. His eyes drifted to the academy's flag. Behind him, Apolpus murmured to the professor that what had happened was an accident during class, and that it could become a problem. He made it clear that he didn't want to have to report every detail to his father, and suggested that the professor understand well what that meant. The professor agreed. They couldn't allow a healer to walk around acting arrogant. In the classroom, Will thought excitedly that he could finally attend classes and absorb everything there was to learn about offensive magic. The professor walked in, shot a quick glance at Will, and turned to face the class. He announced that the lesson would be about creating magical tools. They would be assembling ice bombs. He would distribute the materials, and the students were to follow the instructions instructions while infusing mana. Will recognized the format. At the Healing Academy, there had been a similar subject, but there they only produced potions and recovery items. It made sense that here they were crafting weapons. The expectation was that everyone would infuse dynamic mana, but for the creation of magical tools, the nature of the mana wasn't the most determining factor. Most of it depended on the materials. He figured he could handle this class without too much trouble. He began adding the powdered flame tree branch to the ice golem fragment. It was then that the mana stone started glowing in a strange way. Will hurled it away using physical reinforcement. The explosion shook the entire back of the room. He lay on the floor, surrounded by ice spikes, staring at the ceiling like a complete idiot. The professor reprimanded him immediately, questioning what he thought he was doing. Will explained that the stone had activated before he had even infused it with mana. The professor wasn't interested in explanations and announced that he would be deducting points from his grade. Laughter erupted from the back of the room. Opalpus cackled along with everyone else, staring at Will with that peculiar expression. Will held his gaze. In the next class, on magical creatures, a salamander was positioned right in front of him. In the first row, the seat reserved for students with low grades, as the professor had warned. Will had barely processed how close he was to that creature when it spat fire at him. He blocked with a cauldron. The professor wanted to know why he was holding that. Will said it was necessary. The cauldron was confiscated, so that was how they wanted to play it. They let him attend classes, but had no intention whatsoever of letting him actually learn. From a distance, a girl watched him with a slightly uneasy expression. The harassment didn't stop there. The professor kept calling on Will to answer questions about content he had never studied. From outside, someone reported to the instructor that he had misbehaved, and Will was left without dinner. Back in the dormitory, he lay staring at the ceiling. The wind blew against him in that school, and it was absolutely relentless. There was still a mountain of obstacles ahead, but he was making progress, and he couldn't let that petty harassment get in the way of it. Besides, he had fought with his own hands for the first time and come out victorious. He really could become a battle mage. And he had a textbook in his hand. He needed to review the day's content. The next day, Will arrived at the classroom and there was no one there. It was the right time, but the professor hadn't shown up. The only other person present was that girl from before. The class had moved to a different room and no one had bothered to let them know. Will approached and excused himself before asking whether she thought they had changed rooms. She confirmed she was thinking the same thing. Then she added that since they were the only two there, Will, the student hated by both professors and classmates, she had reached a conclusion. She stated that the two of them were clearly on the same side. Hated loners, she said, made a very good match. Will found the phrase a little blunt, but her tone was serious enough to sound sincere. Either way, he was glad to have gained an ally. He introduced himself cordially, and she did the same. Her name was Erica Glenn. Will remarked that she was the first friend he had made at the academy. Erica replied that given the circumstances, it could hardly be otherwise. After all, he barely showed up to classes, and on top of everything, was a healer. Everyone kept saying healers were weak. She herself never missed a single class and was a battle mage, but she didn't have any friends either. Will reflected on that. Setting her personality aside, discrimination against healers was something deeply ingrained. In his previous life, he had been recognized too early to ever face anything like it. But at an academy specializing in offensive magic, the prejudice was intense, and studying there meant having to fight it too. Erica sighed and asked why he had chosen Schwartz. Will replied that being born a healer wasn't reason enough to stay on the sidelines of the fight. Erica was surprised. He said he had his reasons and turned the question back to her. Erica explained that she came from a small noble family from the countryside. No male heir had been born, and her parents feared the bloodline would die out. The hope was that if she could build a name for herself as a mage, she might be able to take on the role of head of the family. Will understood. Graduating from Schwartz would certainly make that viable. Erica admitted she almost had no talent for offensive magic, which prevented her from forming bonds with her classmates. Classes were torture, and it was the worst possible experience. But now she had made a friend. As long as she had Will, an even greater failure than herself, she would at least not feel so insecure about her poor grades. Will said things might not turn out the way she imagined. Faced with her curiosity, he replied that first they needed to find the room where the class was actually being held. Erica decided to follow him. When they arrived at the classroom, the professor received them coldly. They were late and class had started long ago. Will apologized and explained that no one had informed them about the room change. The professor wasn't interested in explanations, and since Will had shown up, told him to solve the problem on the board. Erica was indignant. They had just arrived. How were they supposed to know if Will had barely had any classes there to begin with? Will faced the board. The professor warned that if he got it right, the matter would be settled, but that if he got it wrong, he would lose points. Opulpus remarked sarcastically that at that rate, Will would be failing soon. Even so, Will picked up the chalk. He began to write. The class watched in silence, many already expecting him to fail. But Will finished, turned to the professor with the complete magic circle on the board, and asked what he thought. The professor was visibly surprised. It was correct. He told Will to sit down. Opulpus let out a shout of shock. Erica couldn't understand how he had managed that. After class, she ran after him, wanting to know. Will explained that, despite seeming complex, it was merely an application of the examples from the textbook he had studied in advance. Erica asked in amazement whether he had read that material on his own. He confirmed that he had done so the previous day. Schwartz's textbook was impeccable. It covered everything, from the basics to advanced application, without any filler. Exactly what one would expect from the best magic academy around. Reading alone was enough. Besides, he had always been good at theory, and the accumulated reasoning from his past life helped greatly in understanding offensive magic. He ended up going to bed late, but it had been worth every minute. Erica's jaw dropped. The content was far too dense to absorb without a professor, and she had thought Will was the weakest student in the class. If he was at that level, where did that leave her? She asked him not to leave her behind. Will placed a hand on her shoulder and said everything was fine. He would teach her anything she didn't understand. They were friends after all. Erica thanked him. Will pondered internally that he hadn't come to Schwartz to make friends, but having Erica around opened up possibilities. He then said he needed a favor in return. The upcoming classes weren't just theory. General offensive magic was on the schedule, and that was precisely why he had failed and been thrown out so many times before. He could manage now, he had even defeated Opulpus, but general offensive magic was still beyond his reach. He had a plan, and he needed her help. He explained the difference. General offensive magic used analyzed and structured formulas, accessible to anyone who learned them. Unique magic, on the other hand, was created within the user and worked exclusively for them. Schwartz had separate classes for each type. In unique magic, there was no single universal right answer, and there he could get by with offensive healing magic. But in general offensive magic, without conjuring the spell, no grade would save him. The professor confirmed it directly. Will may have done well in the written portion, but the practical portion was a different story entirely. The task was simple: hit the target with a fireball, the most basic spell of all. Without that, he could forget about advancing or graduating. The professor suspected that Will had used healing magic in the training bout, and the story about his movements improving after healing even made some sense. But general offensive magic was something else entirely. Someone so incompetent should simply drop the class. It was then that the professor noticed something. Will was smiling, and there was fire in the palm of his hand. A quiet sense of satisfaction settled over him. The professor hadn't noticed a thing. The day before, Will had asked Erica to create a fireball using general offensive magic. He stored the spell inside a salamander tail and hid the tail in his own hand while healing it so it wouldn't burn. Erica had questioned whether that was even possible for a healer, and just who in the world Will was. An instant before releasing the spell, he used healing magic to activate the stored flame charge inside the salamander tail. To any outside observer, it looked as though a fireball had been conjured right there in the palm of his hand. The projectile flew straight and burned the training target. Will turned to the professor with a calm smile and asked what he thought. The professor stared for a moment. That was definitely the flame of a standard spell. The boy may have actually learned. Will was approved and sent back to the line. Erica's jaw dropped again. She ground her teeth. Later, in the classroom, Opulpus got straight to the point. The professor said he would also like to understand what was going on. Opulpus wasn't interested in explanation. A healer had dared to challenge him, and he refused to share a class with that guy. If he was forced to, he would tell his father, and the entire class would be compromised. The professor tried to argue that he was overreacting. Opulpus cut him off. He should use whatever means necessary to get that guy out of his sight. Then he left. The professor was left alone in the room pondering. Trying something outside of class was risky. If caught, the consequences would be very different from those of the spoiled heir throwing his weight around. But sometimes, risks had to be taken to protect one's own position. A mere healer acting like he owned the place, and he didn't even know yet what the other professors were plotting. He wasn't going to let that boy ruin his career. He would have to deal with him personally. After school, on the training field, the professor got straight to the point. He said he felt Will was getting a bit too comfortable with himself, and that was not a compliment. He had missed numerous classes since enrolling. Will considered firing back by pointing out that the absences were the professor's own doing, but decided it wasn't worth it. He explained that he got in the material from a classmate and studied on his own to make up for everything. There was no problem whatsoever. The professor didn't back down. In cases of absence, supplementary classes were mandatory, and the content was determined determined by the responsible professor. It would be a training bout against him personally. Will took a second to process. A professor fighting a student. The professor said he would give him an advantage. Considering the difference in ability, landing just a single hit would be enough to pass. Since he was being so generous, there was no reason to run. What he didn't say out loud was what he was thinking. With that kind of magic, the boy's attacks would never get anywhere near him. He would just beat him until he understood the difference in power, and then he would hear what he had to say. Will agreed. The professor smiled and activated his magic. Will had seen that style once before. It was the one that raced the ground. He dodged quickly, but a strike came from above. He ducked, and the next one came from below. The professor asked with disdain whether running was all he knew how to do. Will straightened up and analyzed the situation. Unlike creation magic, this style manipulated the existing terrain itself, which made it very fast and gave it wide-angle attacks. But it wasn't unavoidable. He leapt, dodged the strikes, and advanced. The professor activated another magic circle on the ground, raising walls on both sides of Will to trap him. He smiled. Will used the walls as leverage and jumped over them, advancing with his weapon in hand. But when he got close enough to land a hit, the professor turned to stone. Will pulled back from the spikes. The professor declared with superiority that the boy was weak. He couldn't even break through his absolute form at that power level. He had never heard of a healer using healing magic to attack, but it was nothing more than a cheap imitation. Wanting to be a battle mage with such pathetic magic was almost laughable. Will responded calmly. Through the deep study of the human body that healing magic provided, he had come to understand that human beings generally live unconsciously holding their own strength back. The reason was simple. The body cannot withstand its maximum output, and attempting to exceed that limit breaks it from within. The professor shot back with disdain that Will was only trying to give a lecture because he couldn't win with offensive magic. Will replied serenely that even removing that internal limiter to release more strength, the body would come out damaged, but he was a healer. It didn't matter if his arm broke. The professor was caught off guard. Will stepped closer with a lopsided smile and said he hated pain, but that he could heal himself on the spot. So then, let them test that together. He moved with full force. The blow landed squarely, and the professor's glasses flew through the air. Will stated that it wasn't a good idea to arbitrarily decide a student's limits. He had learned that when Professor Veronica suggested using healing magic offensively, and there was nothing more foolish than declaring something impossible. He could become far stronger than anyone imagined. But before he even finished the sentence, Will turned sharply and dodged a strike coming from the professor. The two stood face to face. The professor was holding his own glasses, visibly shaken. Will assumed the professor would pass him if he landed just one hit. The professor shouted at him to shut up. There were no witnesses around. Admitting that he had been punched by a healer was something completely unacceptable, and he unleashed a barrage of rocks. Will observed internally that removing the limiter didn't only apply to punches. He planted his feet on the ground and launched himself toward the professor at an absurd speed. The professor barely had time to process what was happening. The stone wall wasn't rising fast enough. He squeezed his eyes shut, then looked to the side trying to figure out whether the movement had stopped, but he couldn't move. The blows kept coming, and the time around him seemed to have slowed to a complete crawl. He begged mentally for Will to stop. The pain was unbearable, far more intense than any blow at normal speed. He couldn't escape, couldn't even scream. He simply pleaded in silence for it all to end. Then he was hurled backward. His body hit the ground hard. Will stepped closer and remarked that for him, it had been just an instant. The professor, still on the ground, demanded that Will explain what he had done. Will replied that, unlike the professor, he could explain it perfectly well. At the exact moment the punch landed, he had activated sensory enhancement on himself, originally a healing spell developed for people with deteriorating vision and hearing. By elevating his reaction speed to an extreme level, his senses became absurdly sharp, causing a single second to fragment into dozens of distinct moments. He wanted to know how much it hurt to receive blows in that state. He then calmly asked whether he had passed the supplementary class. The professor confirmed that he had. Will then added one more thing. He said he knew it would be difficult to undo such deeply ingrained prejudice, but that if the professor continued down that path, he would personally make sure he gained an intimate understanding of exactly what kind of pain his own body was capable of feeling. All he wanted was to attend classes without being bothered by the other students. He asked whether the professor could guarantee that. Later, in the hallways of the Schwartz Academy, the professor walked alone, still trying to digest what had happened. He had always believed healers were weak, devoid of any combat ability, destined to obey offensive mages. But Will was different. He didn't just have fighting ability. He had genuine killing intent. Opulpus appeared appeared and asked whether the class was over, remarking that Will was one step closer to expulsion. The professor told him to shut up and stop going after Will. Treating that boy as just a healer was a mistake Opulpus couldn't afford to make. Opulpus said that wasn't what he wanted to hear and reminded him that if he went to his father, the professor knew very well what would happen. The professor told him to go right ahead. He paused, thought for a moment, and then added, if Opulpus really took this to his father, there was a good chance it would be him who ended up expelled, not Will. Instead of the Omen family making its move as expected, it seemed it would be Will who would extend his claws in the future. Opulpus was left alone in the hallway. He punched the wall in frustration, muttering about the situation closing in around him.